The pressure is just beginning. That's the message that opposition leader Juan Guaido sought to impart to Nicolas Maduro. Just a day after arriving back in Caracas to a hero's welcome, the self-proclaimed interim president vowed to step up pressure, calling again for Maduro to step down. Guaido met with union leaders to discuss possible strikes for state workers, stressing the disconnect between the embattled government and struggling Venezuelans.
Maduro's government officials are drowning in contradictions. They don't know how to respond to Venezuela's people. There's little they can say and no one believes them, not even their own people.
Guaido has called for more protests this coming Saturday, maneuvering to capitalize on the opposition's renewed momentum. But Nicolas Maduro's government has also called for rallies, and their hold on power has proven resilient. At a ceremony marking the 6-year anniversary of Hugo Chávez's death, Maduro didn't mention Guaido by name, but belittled what he called a minority of opportunists.
No podemos caer en provocaciones nunca.
We can't respond to their taunts, never. The members of the opposition may continue with their boy-like games, with their provocations, but we, the country, are here. We, the people, are here.
The Maduro government decided not to arrest the opposition leader upon his return to Venezuela on Monday. This despite Guaido's having defied a travel ban. A sign of restraint or a sign of intense pressure on the Maduro regime, the rift between the leaders and within the country continues, with each side vying for the tactical upper hand.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond. You can find this show here at my website, which is porkinspolicyreview.com. If you are new to the show, there are lots of ways to listen. You can, of course, find everything archived here on my website. You can also follow the RSS feed directly through my website. I'm also on iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Google Play, Podbean, Player FM. Pretty much all major and minor podcatchers out there have my feed. So whatever your preferred podcatcher, it will probably have Porkins Policy Radio on there. Of course, you can also follow my work on YouTube. And if you do like the work that I do on YouTube, then please subscribe to the channel, like the videos, all that kind of stuff. I know it sounds silly, but it really does help me out a lot. Also, something I don't plug enough on the show, but if you do like the podcast, and if you use iTunes, for instance, definitely give us a little rating, write a review. That also helps with traffic and numbers and getting more people exposed to the work that we do here at Porkins Policy Radio. If you like the work that I do, if you want to support me, then you can always go to patreon.com/Pierce Redmond, and you can become a patron of mine for as little as $1 a month. And that single solitary dollar, of course, gives you access to the exclusive bonus podcast. And last month for February, we had our good friend Michael Swanson on the bonus podcast, and we were discussing the recent death of right-wing political cult leader Lyndon LaRouche. So very interesting conversation we had about LaRouche and his impact in conspiracy, alternative media, and we got into some really interesting topics about a person who has certainly kind of faded into the background and is sort of a shell of what he once was, but at one point was an extremely influential right-wing cult leader. So very interesting episode. Definitely encourage you to check that out if you have not already. Very quickly, I also want to plug a couple other shows. I did a really good, probably about an hour and a half, I think, with John Podash, all about his new book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. A lot of really interesting material there, so definitely encourage everyone to check that out if they have not already. Also, I want to thank Mike for recently subscribing to Patreon, so thank you so much, Mike. Again, also, if you want to support the work and you don't want to use Patreon, you can always send a PayPal donation, and that can be a one-time donation, that can be a recurring donation, whatever you like, and you can find the link to my PayPal account on the website. One final thing, I know that I had sort of teased out that I was going to have a very big guest on the show, and that episode is has actually been recorded, but I'm going to be releasing it next week, probably on Tuesday, and that is with legendary radio host and anti-fascist researcher Dave Emery. Of course, he does the show For the Record. You can find all of Dave's work at spitfirelist.com. Very, very good conversation I had with Dave. Very long one, too. It's about over 2 hours. So really good. Very excited. And hopefully Dave Emery will be back on the show again in the near future. But this week, I am very excited to be joined on the line from Venezuela by journalist Ricardo Vaz of VenezuelaAnalysis.com. We were just remarking before we started recording that this has been a long time in the making. I think I first mentioned that I was going to have Ricardo on the show maybe almost about a month back. And we had some technical difficulties that we had to kind of iron out. But as I said, very excited to finally have Ricardo here to join us. So Ricardo Vaz, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, and great to finally be on.
Absolutely. Ricardo, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and the work that you do at VenezuelaAnalysis.com. So who is Ricardo Vaz?
Well, good question. I'm a writer and editor at VenezuelaAnalysis.com. This is an alternative, independent media outlet that's based in Venezuela, and it's the only one of its kind in English. So, if you go back to our roots, Venezuela Analysis was founded in 2003, and this was months after this short-lived coup in 2002. And one of the main characteristics of the coup was that there was a huge media disinformation campaign, and so Venezuela Analysis started and has always had this mission of providing what's missing in the mainstream narrative in English.
Absolutely, and a critical news outlet, one that I highly encourage the listeners to go and read, and definitely to support as well. It's completely independently funded. It's one of a kind. We had on one of your co-workers, Paul Dobson, back a couple of months ago to discuss something that we'll probably bring up at some point. That was the failed assassination attempt on Nicolas Maduro. But I've been talking on and off on this show and on other shows that I do guest appearances on about the situation in Venezuela. Ricardo, the situation is, it's ever changing. It's evolving every day. Sometimes it seems a bit more, extreme, like something is about to happen. Other times it kind of settles down a little bit. So let's just kind of jump right into the latest that's been going on in Venezuela. Just on Monday, the so-called interim president Juan Guaido returned to Venezuela after he went on a sort of South American tour, I guess. He was in Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and also Ecuador. He met with the leaders of these various countries in order to garner more support for the U.S.-backed regime change operation. I believe he even met with Mike Pence in Colombia as well. But now he has returned to, I guess some fanfare in Venezuela. There was, I was watching the news coverage, online, and I was following it on Twitter on Monday when Guaido returned to Venezuela. And of course, we had all of the usual suspects coming out, John Bolton, Marco Rubio, and others, saying that if anything happened to Guaido, that Maduro would be held responsible, and it would be catastrophic, and the U.S. would have to get involved more if he was arrested. These were the reports that were circulating, and it seems as if not a whole lot really happened. There were pictures and video of Guaido at customs. I think in the Caracas airport, no problems there. He hasn't been arrested. He was at some rallies and stuff. So, Ricardo, as someone that is in Venezuela right now, paint a picture for the listeners. What has it been like since Guaido has returned to Venezuela?
Yes, so first of all, lots of things happened, between when we were first scheduled to speak and when we are actually speaking now. But so Monday he's announced return. So he was talking about returning ever since late last week. There was this expectation that there might be a new flashpoint if he was arrested, because if we recall, so he proclaimed himself president on January 23rd, and a few days later the public prosecution submitted a request to the Supreme Court for an investigation. The Supreme Court at this moment issued a ban on him traveling, so he was forbidden from leaving the country, and yet he left the country to attend this concert and then the efforts to ram aid across the border on February 23rd, and then he did this tour as you mentioned. One small parenthesis I'd like to make is that you mentioned that he met with Mike Pence in Colombia, and he did, and there were some reports that did not catch much traction in the English press, in the English-speaking press, but in Spanish, in a couple of outlets, it was reported that Mike Pence actually scolded Guaido, or expressed his unhappiness, because we are 6 weeks into this, and he's not much further than where he started. And so, according to these reports, Pence was unhappy that it seems that Guaido gave an idea that the military was going to fall in line behind him much more easily than it actually has. And so after that, he did this tour of Latin America, as you were saying, and then he was scheduled to return on Monday. One report that emerged before he arrived by an investigative journalist here in Venezuela was that there was actually no arrest warrant for Guaido. So that already gave more or less an idea that he would enter the country without any issues. And also, people should be reminded he's in the National Assembly, so he has parliamentary immunity. So for him to be arrested, this parliamentary immunity would have to be lifted first. And so, you never know what happens, and things are very unpredictable, and there are many security agencies involved, and they could have tried something off script. But in the end, he just, as you said, he went through migration and customs without any issues, and then went to address his supporters. And so it was funny. We were actually mocking Marco Rubio on Twitter because he was saying that Guaido arrived triumphantly, and this is going to inspire the military to switch sides. And we were saying, going through customs is not really going to sway anyone at this point.
Yeah, and it was so funny seeing Marco Rubio and John Bolton, but definitely Rubio in particular. You could tell they almost wanted something extreme and drastic to happen. They would have been just tickled pink if he was arrested or something major happened. And of course, just thinking pragmatically. Why would Maduro or the Venezuela government play into the U.S.'s hand by arresting him? I mean, that would just, of course, escalate the situation. And the thing that kind of strikes me, Ricardo, and I'd like to get your again as someone on the ground there, your perspective on this. But you mentioned, Mike Pence kind of scolding him that this isn't really turning out the way that I assume the U.S. wanted. We don't see much of the situation is basically the same as it was when Guaido first proclaimed himself president. But, I mean, what's the sense on the ground? I mean, is there a renewed support for Guaido? I mean, I know that there were these pictures of these large rallies that he was holding, but do we see, is the general population, have they changed their stance towards Guaido? Is there more support, less support? Are people kind of beginning to perhaps question whether this is really going to go anywhere?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first, going back to your first point, yes, the U.S. was very much daring Maduro to arrest him, and you get the idea that Guaido at this point would be much more useful, in prison as a political prisoner than he is as a political operative. So, I mean, there's no two ways about it. I mean, this is not going according to plan, and this is certainly not the timeline in which the U.S. expected this to unfold. I mean, this, as I said, it has been going on for 6 weeks, and nothing too significant has happened. I mean, they tried this humanitarian aid showdown at the border that was supposed to be, the apocalypse, and not much happened. They even tried to create some kind of violent flashpoints also on the Venezuelan side of the border, but they didn't get very far. And so, yeah, I mean, there's so the Venezuelan opposition by and large has been very divided for many years, and this is part of what explains their inability to make any inroads in getting to power despite this devastating economic crisis. And so then all of a sudden they were forced to fall in line behind Guaido, and he proclaimed himself president. Also, if I can make another parenthesis, for observers on the ground, it was surprising that the opposition showed such a united face. And it turns out that our suspicions were correct. I mean, there were reports shortly after that when Guaido proclaimed himself president, he caught a large section of the opposition by surprise. So while in Washington everyone knew what he was going to do, within his own opposition coalition, not so much. And so he generated this very large mobilization on January 23rd, but ever since then there have been other rallies. There's been a rally on February 2nd, on February 12th. There was this humanitarian aid showdown on February 23rd, and then his return on Monday. And it's fair to say that the numbers have consistently dwindled on the streets. So, and this is in part to do with one of the fatal flaws of the Venezuelan opposition, is that they always proclaim that the end is near, and so they claim that they are going to get rid of Maduro, they're going to get rid of the regime within hours, and then of course their supporters get disillusioned when things drag on and nothing happens. The situation on the streets, I mean, if you go out and you go about your daily life, you'd almost, you wouldn't notice that there's a coup going on. I mean, if you don't follow these feverish discussions on social media, you would be remiss. It wouldn't really affect you in any significant way. I mean, one thing that you can always notice is that when the opposition calls for a rally here in Caracas, you can identify the starting points, and the starting points are still very much within these middle-class strongholds in the east of Caracas. And so it's very much their own support base that does go out in numbers, but they definitely haven't made any inroads in gathering any support beyond that. And that is also one of the reasons why people are getting disenchanted, and also why one can start to speculate whether Guaido would be more useful as a quote-unquote political prisoner than as a political leader.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, not to get too far ahead of ourselves with speculation or alternative theories about this, but I mean, I would genuinely be kind of scared if I was Guaido that something, that they would instigate something, whether that be, from his own side, getting him arrested or worse, in order to make him into more of a political martyr as opposed to just this sort of political figure. Because it doesn't seem as if he's really mobilizing the kind of support that he would need in order to topple the government. And I think that also just sort of kind of goes to show you that the reality in Venezuela is much different than particularly different from the perception that we get here in the West.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and also it's not too far-fetched. I mean, if we recall, in 2014 there were these violent street protests called guarimbas, which were led by Leopoldo Lopez. Leopoldo Lopez is the leader of Voluntad Popular, Popular Will, which is the party of Guaido. And after Leopoldo Lopez started this street mobilization, at some point there were very strong indications that there were plans to kill him because he would become much more of much more useful as a martyr. And actually, his wife went on the record thanking the government for protecting him. So it's not to say that anything like that is going to happen, but it wouldn't be unthinkable.
No, and I think it's just also, if something like that does happen, we should certainly view that, with some suspicion or at least view it a little bit critically, because again, that is, Marco Rubio and Bolton and others, Pence, the coup leaders. I think they would very much love to see Guaido turned into a political martyr, as opposed to this guy who, again, what 80% of Venezuelans didn't know who he was. I would, while he is well known, I guess now, certainly in Venezuela and the world over, I don't get the sense that people really are, connecting with him, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he's not very charismatic. He's not offering any actual solutions to any of the problems facing everyday Venezuelans, which are, for the majority are really external problems caused by the U.S. and the UK and other, Western countries. But, he's not really offering anything. And he is just kind of this, goofy guy who's sort of going around and doing, having these rallies, and then he, goes to Colombia to get his marching orders from Mike Pence. I mean, again, just the optics of that, the vice president of the United States scolding the so-called, legitimate leader of a foreign country. It doesn't really bode well for, the average opposition, supporters on the street, when your leader is obviously his agenda is being dictated by a foreign government. It's the optics of it are not good. You just very briefly, you mentioned these flashpoints, this standoff, I guess, on this bridge, and about the aid. And I just want to kind of break that down very quickly, because that is, of course, one of these things that always gets brought up. Oh, they're not letting in aid. Look what they're doing. They're attacking the protesters and whatnot. And Ricardo, if you can, just kind of break that down, give us a little bit more of the reality behind that. Because number one, Venezuela is accepting aid from a variety of countries, just not a country like the U.S., where clearly the aid is, it's like, why would you take aid from your abuser? You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's sort of like a strange thing. Like, if you were being held captive or something like that, you're not going to, gladly necessarily accept aid from your jailer. You know what I mean? If you were in prison. So there's that aspect of it, and then there's also this, there are videos that have been circulating online that appear to show the opposition as the ones that were throwing Molotov cocktails, which eventually, set fire to these trucks. And, is it far-fetched to believe that this is all, this showdown on the bridge was really just a bit of political theater?
Yes. First, going back to what you were saying about Guaido's charisma, Max Blumenthal and other journalists from the Grey Zone Project were here on the ground, and they went to an opposition rally, and I think it was Max Blumenthal who said that Guaido had the charisma of a filing cabinet, something like this. And also on the taking orders from the US, two things. First of all, there's a hardcore support base that's very right wing, which doesn't really mind taking orders from the US. I mean, you'll see them in the rallies wearing fake Trump wigs or dressed as Captain America and this sort of thing. As for the showdown on the bridge, it's true that this one of the trucks, or I think it was the second truck on the bridge, caught fire. And I mean, this was instantly blamed on the government, the tyrant who's burning aid and not letting it get into his needing people. But as you said, the evidence showed, and this was seen at the time, that there were opposition protesters throwing Molotov cocktails to the armed to the National Guard that was defending the bridge, whereas the Venezuelan forces only had tear gas and rubber bullets, and so at least based on this evidence, they did not have anything that would set the truck on fire. But again, all these things only generate a frenzy at the time, and blame is instantly assigned, and then nobody's actually interested in looking at the evidence and drawing careful conclusions.
I'm sorry. No, go ahead. I keep interrupting you.
Another interesting aspect about the humanitarian aid, before going into the numbers, is that it was very much publicized that this was going to bring desperately needed medicine for cancer patients and people with diabetes and so on. But then a New York Times reporter himself, I don't remember his name, but he said that USA did not report any medicine at all in the shipments. So it was very much theater more than anything else. And finally, on the aid itself, I always bring up these numbers. The US pledged $20 million, and I think after they had an OAS conference, the total rose to $100 million. And it sounds like a lot, and it is a lot. But if you compare to the losses that have been incurred by sanctions, if you go back just to the latest round, this oil embargo in late January, John Bolton himself said that by forbidding all US companies from buying US oil, this is going to cost Venezuelan coffers $11 billion over 2019. So 11 billion is around 30 million per day. Mm-hmm. So the amount that the US pledged is less than what just the latest round of sanctions is costing in a single day. So that's all.
It's a shocking number. You were also, you just mentioned this was supposed to have medicine and things. This is also, the U.S. is responsible for massive quantities of medicine not getting into Venezuela because of sanctions. And that's, I saw that Abby Martin recently had an interview with Alfred Dizayas, who is a UN investigator, human rights rapporteur, and he, just to throw out some more of these sort of statistics, because I think it's important, he mentioned that Citibank was blocked 300,000 doses of insulin that were meant to go to Venezuela, massive amounts of money and stuff. So there's this idea that also that 1 or 2 truckloads of aid is going to solve the problem. That's also part of this political theater. Even if we accepted that this is all wonderful, the U.S. is only doing stuff out of the goodness of their own heart. It's again that 1 or 2 trucks is really going to make a difference, but it's rich coming from a country that has routinely blocked medicine. For children, for the elderly, just for people that are sick. So again, there's so much political theater with that particular thing, and it really did kind of remind me a lot of the sort of like Euromaidan events, leading up to the Ukrainian regime change operation. Again, where you things start getting firebombed, stuff escalates really quickly, and then when you actually take a step back and look, you start to see, it's a lot of these right-wing factions aligned with the U.S. and whatnot. So, and it's interesting too that the incident on the bridge, the U.S. hasn't tried to repeat it. Which I think also should sort of speak volumes. If they were really committed to bringing aid and whatnot, why not try it again? So it's curious in that sense as well. Even that sort of stunt seems to not have really paid off. Beyond it being a great talking point, on Fox News. They can go on and on about the evils of socialism.
Yeah, I think if you break it down, not just the aid stand, but also every Guaido speech and even every statement by Mike Pence or Mike Pompeo or John Bolton, they're all directed at the military. So all these incidents and these statements are meant to provoke some kind of rift in the armed forces that will swing or actually in this case generate any power for Guaido inside Venezuela. So this was what they hoped with the border showdown, that a section of the military would actually switch sides or force the others to let the aid in. But since this failed, and perhaps this is related to Pence scolding Guaido, there's no point in trying it again, at least for now, regardless of them coming up with these numbers of how many members of the armed forces have deserted.
Well, and let's get into that a little bit, because that's an interesting part of this whole story and this narrative. And you're so spot on there too with all of these speeches and stuff. It's all directed at the military. Again, Guaido is not offering up. Well, this is my alternative to the policies of Maduro. He doesn't have that. Instead, it's all this like, come on, you in the military, you've got to, wake up and help me overthrow the government. They all seem, tailor-made to that. Again, because I don't think that Guaido really even has the intellectual capacity to come up with alternatives. And clearly, his puppet masters in the U.S., they don't seem eager to give him like here's a set of policies that you should advocate for. But it all seems, like you said, designed to elicit a particular reaction from the military. And just on that, before Guaido returned to Caracas from Colombia, he, of course, sat down to talk to the Washington Post and he gave an interview. I'll link up to this in the show notes. But there's some kind of wild claims there. They seem wild to me that Guaido made, specifically about, some of the military stuff. He says, number one, 80% of the armed forces support him. There have been 200 defections. Now, that number seems to, have been inflated yet again by John Bolton, who just throws out the wildest numbers. I mean, Bolton was saying 600 defections. And again, in this Washington Post interview, Guaido, again, urges the military to overthrow Maduro, which the Washington Post they say, well, wouldn't that be a coup? And Guaido says, no, it would be they would, quote, ceasing the usurpation.
Yes.
And in, this like Orwellian double thing, Guaido actually said that, if Maduro stopped him, that would be a coup. This is the unelected, CIA, chosen one, saying that the elected leader of Venezuela would be implementing a coup were he to stop him. But break down some of these numbers about the defections, because it strikes me that there haven't really been. Now, maybe there are 200 defections. Maybe, let's see, maybe John Bolton is right. There have been 600. But do these represent anything substantial? It doesn't, if people can remember all the way back, when the U.S. and Western countries were getting involved in Syria, there were some high-level defections from the Syrian armed forces, some generals and colonels and whatnot that went over to the Free Syrian Army in the very early stages, and that eventually kind of stopped. I don't really see that with Venezuela. I know that there was an Air Force general who at least declared, that he was backing Guaido. And I know that there is this retired general, I'm probably going to mispronounce it, but Cleaver Alcala, who's in Colombia, who, I don't know, has some sort of, militia force that he was ready to march into Venezuela. But what is your sense about these defections? I mean, do we take them seriously? Are these just low-level soldiers that have defected and fled the border into Colombia? I mean, what should we really make about this, Ricardo?
Yes, so first of all, about the numbers, it's hard to really know. Officially, according to the highest ranking military officer, Vladimir Padrino, who is the Minister of Defense, it's only 100. Then Guaido said 200, and then he had to change after Pence and Rubio said 600. But still, this is out of a total of 200,000 armed men and women. So it's very minor, and even this Air Force general that you mentioned, he did not actually command any battalion. He was in charge of the army here is very much involved in some sectors of the economy, and so he was responsible for kind of food supply. But if there are 600 in Colombia, maybe they can get them together for a group photo or something, so we can be sure. But yes, so far, and despite all these repeated appeals, there hasn't been any movement in the armed forces, and certainly not in the higher ranking officers. And this is for two reasons. First of all, we shouldn't have any illusions. The military controls some sectors of the economy, and so they also have things to lose if the Maduro government goes out of power. And on the other hand, whereas some section of the opposition will be very much open to taking orders from the United States, there is very much a patriotic anti-imperialist spirit within the armed forces since Chavez. So they are not going to be very easily swayed by someone who's very clearly taking his marching orders from Washington, as you say. And also, on this subject, there was, the media sometimes are less careful and say things or write things that they shouldn't. So, for example, today there was a news article on Bloomberg that actually revealed that there was a kind of a battalion of 200 either retired or exiled Venezuelans that wanted to stage an attack on the bridge to force the aid in, and in the end this was stopped by the Colombians. So this was the main subject of the story. But then he was also talking about this Latin American tour that Guaido did, and it said, very casually that Guaido also wanted to do a tour of European capitals, but Washington told him to return to Venezuela, otherwise he would lose his momentum. So they're not even hiding on who's writing the script.
Oh, and it's not even just that. I read that article too, and I was shocked that like you said, Bloomberg kind of throws that in there. That's what's so interesting. I don't know if maybe that's not the best adjective to use for this, but what's so interesting about this particular regime change operation coup, however you want to phrase it, is how open the U.S. is about its motives. Bolton, since day one, stated this is basically about oil. He's talking about this administration is proudly upholds the Monroe Doctrine.
The Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, he's not even hiding it. It's really not about human rights or democracy or any of these things. It's about oil and about the fact that, according to John Bolton, this is our backyard. Venezuela is in our hemisphere, as if America controls the whole hemisphere. And, that's what this is really about. You mentioned, that sometimes these, media outlets say honest things. The Wall Street Journal had an article I'll link up to where they basically, they stated that this was all a plan hatched by a very small faction within the opposition, completely in tandem with the U.S., and that even opposition figures were shocked and, upset when Guaido suddenly announced himself to be president, because they were completely kept out of the loop. So, I don't know, it's funny how sort of, nakedly imperialistic this whole coup has been. I don't know if that's like, maybe that's just the new sort of way that the U.S. is going to operate. But, in some ways it's kind of refreshing. At least
Yes.
where they stand. Exactly. They're not hiding it anymore.
Yeah, so I think it was Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza. who once at the United Nations said that, this time the US is not behind the coup, it's actually at the forefront.
Yes, right, exactly.
Yeah, I remember this Wall Street Journal article. And, one thing that people don't know, you always hear that, Guaido was chosen as the president of the National Assembly. But he wasn't very much elected by his fellow members of the assembly. What happened is that the opposition won the majority in December 2015. And as I was saying in the beginning, they're not very much in agreement about anything. And so what they did was that this position of the Speaker of the House or President of the Assembly, they split between the four main parties on a yearly basis. And so the first year it went to Acción Democrática, Democratic Action. The second year it went to Primera Justicia. The third year it went to A New Time. And then finally it was the turn of this most right-wing party, Voluntad Popular. And Guaido just happened to be the highest ranking figure of the party because, as I was saying, Leopoldo Lopez is in house arrest for his role in the violent protests in 2014. The next figure was Freddy Guevara, and he's holed up in the Chilean embassy for his role in the 2017 violent protests. And so Guaido was simply next in line. And as you were saying, this was also reported, I think, by Associated Press. He actually started a tour of Washington, D.C., Bogota, and Brasilia a couple of months before he actually took office as the president of the National Assembly. So this was indeed cooked by a very small group of the Venezuelan opposition, of these most hardline figures, and very much in consensus with the State Department. But it's interesting, as you were saying. I mean, you almost got used to with Obama of this more, say, gentle way of presenting this, beacon of freedom and democracy. Whereas now everything is out in the open. Bolton is saying, it would be good for everyone if our oil companies were extracting oil in Venezuela. Also, let me just go back to something you said a couple of minutes ago. You were saying that Guaido has not really offered anything. Well, he has offered, but it's not something that he can offer very loudly. So the opposition has something they call Plan País. So it's a kind of a plan for the country. So it's kind of an economic blueprint of what they intend to do if they can reach power. And this is kind of neoliberalism on steroids. Privatizing the oil industry, allowing foreign investment into every public sector company, this sort of thing. So in that sense, for example, now Guaido is trying to garner support with public employees, and so he cannot say that as soon as he takes power, he's going to privatize everything. So they also have a kind of a balance to strike between what they present to their hardcore base and to what they hope will, in their hopes of getting support beyond their traditional base, which they haven't been able to do so far.
And people could also, even if they want to also have like a glimpse into what what might be Guaido's talking points or his economic plan. Back in the 2002 coup, when Pedro Carmona briefly was took power for 24 hours or something. 48. He did he made all of these declarations basically outlining a lot of things you were just talking about there, Ricardo. Mm-hmm. Privatizing everything, cutting public sector jobs, changing the oil industry, basically reversing. I guess probably my understanding, bring Venezuela back to what it was like in the 80s and early 90s.
Well, actually, quite literally, because the first thing they did in 2002 was to throw out the Constitution. So right. To go back to the 1961 Constitution. And it's actually pretty funny that, many of the leaders who were quite young at the time during this coup, Julio Borges, Enrique Capriles, Leopoldo Lopez that I mentioned, Maria Corina, who was also very much liked by U.S. outlets, they were all at the forefront of this coup. They all signed this this so-called Carmona decree, and now they are claiming that they are the ones upholding the Constitution and whatnot, and the media takes them seriously.
Let's touch on that a little bit, because that's another one of these things that kind of gets bandied about. Where there, you'll hear this from Fox News, from NPR, runs the gamut. All the major outlets, all the political figures, be they Democrats, Republicans. This is all about upholding the Constitution and whatnot. I mean, maybe I'm incorrect in this, but my understanding is that, I mean, even if this is really about upholding the Constitution, Guaido still, there's no constitutional protocol by which the head of the National Assembly would become the president, right?
Yes and no. So the article that everyone seems to be an expert on is Article 233. I mean, you can find the Constitution in English on the web. And so it says that, if the president becomes unavailable to serve, and then it has a list of reasons, death, resignation, removal by the Supreme Court, a bunch of conditions which are not met. So if this happens within the first 4 years of his government, then the vice president would take office. So, in this case, even if Maduro had abandoned the office, it would be the vice president and not the president of the National Assembly. And only if it happens during the last 2 years of the term does the president of the National Assembly take executive responsibilities. But, with this condition that he has to call for elections within 30 days. And actually 30 days went by very quickly, which is why, you still hear this vague constitutional argument, but nobody's talking about Article 233 specifically anymore, because this deadline of 30 days has come and gone.
And I guess too, when you really start to kind of dig into it, and you bring those things up, well, they say, oh well, but Maduro, he stacked the Supreme Court, and the election was unfair, even though, again, the only reason that they're claiming the election is unfair is because they stupidly boycotted it. The opposition, in part because I assume they knew they weren't going to win. But it's like they keep kind of moving the goalposts. They kind of keep changing the whole thing. Again, it's all about the Constitution, even though the Constitution is fairly upfront about how a succession of power would happen if the president was no longer fit for office. And it's so funny too, because they now you see the opposition supposedly loving the Constitution, when it wasn't that long ago that they were constantly complaining about it. And that if they got in, they would have to alter the Constitution, to fit them and to ensure that their cronies and stuff would sort of stay in there. And again, too, if that happened and Guaido stacks the Supreme Court, suddenly they'd have no problem with that. Which is what all politicians do. We here in America, we stack the president stacks the Supreme Court however he wants to.
Yes.
I don't know why that's even a threat to democracy. I mean, we don't have any problem when we do it here. But I mean, that's what, again, it's so transparent when it comes to the reality of the situation. It has nothing to do with the Constitution, because if it did, they would actually be following it.
Yes, I think this issue on finding a constitutional article that's going to back their actions, it has to do with them realizing that the Constitution is very much something treasured by everyone. I mean, it came out of a very democratic constituent process in 1999, and so they cannot just come out in the open and say they want to get rid of it, even though they probably do.
Yeah, but exactly.
But going back to what you were saying of the opposition boycotting the elections, this actually it was a series of blunders. So you can actually, and you can go back further, but we can start at in the middle of 2017. There were these violent street protests, and the opposition kind of had some momentum behind them. And then Maduro called for the Constituent Assembly. And at this point, I mean, if the opposition decided that they were going to take part in the Constituent Assembly, I'm not going to say they would win a majority, but they would at least gain a foothold in that body that would completely, they could completely stop it from functioning. But they had this crazy idea that somehow they would stop these elections from taking place altogether. And then when the elections took place, the opposition momentum vanished from, overnight. The election was on July 30, and on July 31st, there were no more protests on the streets. And this gave political momentum back to Chavismo. So then in October, there were regional elections in which the opposition took part, and Chavismo won 19 out of 23 governorships. And then in December, there were municipal elections, and the opposition went back to boycotting them. So they in 6 months, they kind of lost all political initiative that they had. And as this went on, there were these negotiations taking place in the Dominican Republic between delegation from the government and the opposition, and the opposition demand had always been the same. They wanted early presidential elections. And so when finally the agreement was ready, scheduling early presidential elections, at the last hour, the opposition just walked away. When, if we're honest, there's no guarantee that they would have won, very far from it. There's also no guarantee that they could have ever agreed on a candidate. But they had a shot. Even if we analyze it in retrospect, the candidate that did run, from this more moderate faction of the opposition, Henry Falcon, he was probably the ideal profile to run in this kind of election because he's a former Chavista, and not a very good one at that, if we might add. But he had the kind of profile to sort of reach out to disenchanted former government supporters. But the opposition just has this all or nothing crazy attitude, and so they decided to boycott. And then fast forward 6 months, and that's where we are today.
It's so funny. The like you said, the way the opposition acts. It's just like all or nothing. Like you said, they claim that all of the elections are rigged, but they don't participate in them. They don't like the Constituent Assembly, but as you rightfully point out, they boycotted that. They didn't want to run, even though they were encouraged to do so. And maybe they weren't going to win a majority, but they could at least. That's what kind of again, I think it is very. They illustrate this very well with the opposition. It's not. This is nothing to do with democracy or anything like that, or upholding, the ideals of the Venezuelan constitution or whatnot. This really is. They just want to get into power. There's nothing else about that. They want to do it in the most undemocratic means. And they don't really have any qualms about it. And it's just like when they're actually forced to, run politically, many times they don't want to do it. And I think that just sort of speaks volume. Again, if the opposition is so large, I'm not talking about the political elites that control the opposition, just the opposition on the ground in Venezuela. If it was so large, then why not, where are they? Why aren't they asking for more people to be running? Why aren't they running, again, the Constituent Assembly offered anybody, could throw their name into the hat. That's like the whole, we don't have time to get into the whole ins and outs of it. But, it is like a real kind of like people power moment, but they just don't want to do it. And I think that's also just kind of goes to show you that, in Iran, is a good example of this. When you're talking about this opposition, you really are talking about a much smaller minority of, middle class to wealthy people, that, there's also a racial component to that as well, that kind of want to just see things going back to the way they were, to make Venezuela great again, yes. So to speak. That's really where they're going with all of this. And just on the some of the other opposition figures, just give us a sense of like where they're at right now. You mentioned Leopoldo Lopez, who is under house arrest. He's described as being the mentor to Guaido, and even though he's under house arrest, he's rumored to really be kind of pulling the strings. We've got Lopez. There's also Julio Borges, who's in, I think, self-imposed exile in Colombia. He was implicated in the failed assassination attempt on Maduro. And then there's, and I'm going to butcher his name, Juan Requesens, I think, who was detained, for his involvement in the drone attack. Where are they right now in the whole scheme of things? How do they fit into this?
So let me just add a couple of things. You already said it pretty much, everything. There's, this Venezuelan opposition, the leadership is from these traditional elites, this handful of oligarchic families that control the country. And so they have a sense of property, of a country that belonged to them and was stolen by these people that are poor and they are of color and so on. And so there's a very strong element of class and racial hatred in their speech, and also a failure to recognize Chavismo as a legitimate political movement, which is also why they are very prone to make these political miscalculations. So going back to the opposition figures that you mentioned, yes, Leopoldo Lopez was very much reported by everyone as being involved in this small circle that was running the show leading to Guaido's self-proclamation. Julio Borges was, for a while, kind of a leader of the opposition. He led this delegation that was negotiating in the Dominican Republic, and then he went into exile and he's touring and asking everyone to impose more sanctions on Venezuela. And he's wanted for links to this early August assassination attempt against Maduro, but he's in Colombia or in Europe. Requesens is also, if I'm not mistaken, from Guaido's political party, and he had always been very much involved in these violent street protests, like Guaido, while we're at it. And yes, at least the evidence that was released was that he was the one who made certain contacts to allow these operatives to cross the border from Colombia with the drones and the explosives. He has been arrested he's been in prison for I think a couple of months now. But yeah, these are some figures. There are others more mainstream opposition figures. If you look at the moment in which the opposition came closest to seizing power, this was the election in 2013. Right after Chavez died, and Capriles lost narrowly to Maduro. And this was a moment when the opposition kind of found a way to reach out into the disaffected or unhappy sections of Chavismo, and they came very close to winning. They managed to find a discourse that did not, for example, outright reject the social missions. They simply said, we're going to manage them better. But after this failed, they kind of went back to their traditional way of doing things, in street protests and wanting to topple the government immediately, and to the extreme of calling for a foreign invasion right now. But these figures like Capriles, they were strangely silent in the run-up to the self-proclamation, and of course later you found out why. And actually Capriles said as much in an interview that we didn't know. And Capriles is probably the most, let's say, the most mainstream figure in the opposition. So if he didn't know, then it was really very much a plot hatched by very few people.
Yeah, it's so startling in its scope, and it just seems so kind of in your face. And like I said, this sort of naked imperialism that's going on. A few other things, Ricardo, that I wanted to cover with you. One is just because it's like John Bolton is just, so unhinged at the moment right now, and he just seems like he's throwing out everything. But this one is just this his troika of tyranny, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. And while they tried to overthrow Ortega in Nicaragua not that long ago, a couple months ago. Again, very similar with these, street protests, a lot of right-wing figures coming out of the woodwork, firebombing places. But that seems to, have kind of failed, and Ortega is still in power. But Bolton's focus has shifted to America's, one of its oldest arch enemies and former, colonial, conquest, Cuba. And is there I am really just shocked by how outrageous he said there are 20 to 25,000 Cuban intelligence officials operating in Venezuela. Number one, I would be shocked if they had that many employees in Cuban intelligence in general.
Altogether, yes.
Yeah, that's crazy. It's Cuba is not that big a country. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But what's the sense on the ground in Venezuela, even amongst the opposition? Do they buy into that this whole that Cuba is pulling all the strings, as if again, Venezuela is. Leaps and bounds. It's more developed, I would say, than Cuba. They're certainly wealthier. Why? I don't even know how that would work. But do people, even on the ground in Venezuela, do they buy into that? Or is this, solely for American consumption?
No, actually, it's a bit of a trend, within these high-ranking figures like Julio Borges and Leopoldo Lopez. They often say these absurd things, that Maduro, every time he goes to Cuba, it's to get his orders, even though, as you said, Cuba is a much smaller country than Venezuela. But these idiotic quotes sometimes get filtered out when you go to the mainstream press. But there have been stories. For example, a few years ago, there was this underwater cable to provide high-speed internet to Cuba. And these opposition figures were saying that, this is going to be used for the Cubans to vote in our elections. It was one. There was another in which Cuba was supplying these fluorescent high-efficiency light bulbs. And the opposition was saying that, the Cubans are going to spy on us through the light bulbs. But, yeah, it's very amateurish. Worse than Bolton was Marco Rubio. At a couple of days ago, he tweeted a picture of... I think it was General Padrino meeting with somebody else, and there's someone standing at the door.
Yes.
And he just circled him and wrote Cuban agent. So this is the kind of evidence that they're based upon.
I know that that was like when Rubio was just, I don't know what he was on when he was, tweeting nonstop. This is, I think, the same time period where he tweeted a picture of Gaddafi and basically called for Maduro to be, sodomized and murdered on, CNN. Then he throws up a picture of Noriega, which didn't even make sense. It's just like the CIA, drug trafficker that we overthrew, for exercising the slightest amount of independence. It's just, or for wanting more of a cut of the coke money. It just so bizarre. But the picture with the Cuban agent one, that really was like, that seemed to be, just trying to tap into this base level fear, kind of red baiting. This is a literal, shadowy figure. You can't make out who this person is.
There's just a security guard on the door.
Yeah, well, exactly. Obviously, he's literally nobody. But yeah, it's just there he is, the omnipresent Cuban agent that's puppeteering everything. Again, as if how would Cuba even have that kind of influence? I just don't understand. It's just the power dynamic is so vastly different, between a country like Venezuela and a country like Cuba. But it's shocking. I guess it's still kind of it plays. Once again, just because I'd love to get your perspective on this. What do Venezuelans make of? I have a feeling what they make of John Bolton, and he's so blatant. I would be weary of him, even if some of these opposition figures. He is so upfront about this is about America colonizing Venezuela, and flexing its imperial. He would really, just send aircraft carriers down there and just start bombing them, if he could, I mean, but what about like Marco Rubio? I mean, is he at all respected or liked? I mean, he seems like, he's such a phony, and again, also seems to be very much this sort of naked imperialist. But I mean, is he taken at all seriously inside Venezuela?
I think the opposition does take him seriously. I mean, this is the same sector of the opposition that dresses up like Trump and calls for a foreign invasion. Yeah, sure, they take Rubio seriously, and you'll see if you read his tweets whenever he says something this absurd, then there are always people saying, we're going to name a street after you when this is over.
Right.
This kind of thing. For the most part, I don't think people pay that much attention to Rubio. Bolton is slightly different because since Bolton is always threatening, he's always kind of the face of this imminent aggression. He has kind of become the focus of the government communication in saying this is the devil, and which is not too far fetched if we think about it. But yes, Bolton is very much seen, at least from the government side, as the one leading the aggression.
Oh, and it's funny too. You look at clearly Donald Trump. It's funny people dressing up like Trump. I mean, I honestly don't think Donald Trump knows anything about what's going on. He seems to have completely just like exported this one out. Contracted this one out to Mike Pence and Bolton and also to Pompeo. Which is
and also someone who we haven't mentioned who is Elliot Abrams.
Yes, actually, yeah. Let's get into that a little bit as well. I mean, the Elliot Abrams one is really. I mean, should just really kind of send shivers down your spine, especially too that he's implicated in the 2002 coup against Chavez, and that's like just sort of like not even an open secret. I mean, it's like an accepted fact. That he was, more or less gave the green light for that to go ahead. But that also is shocking to me that Trump seems so removed from this, and that as far as we know, Guaido hasn't even spoken to Trump, right?
I think he has on the phone. I mean, at least they tweeted about it. But you never know. I mean, it could just be a 30-second conversation.
Sure.
But yes, I mean, Abrams, he was really unexpected, and it was in late January, and these were kind of the most tense days in which you were really worried that something very drastic was about to happen very imminently. When you bring someone like Abrams out of retirement, someone. He has like several different episodes which on their own would, disqualify him from ever appearing in public life again,
Yes.
Only just in Central America, there's El Salvador, there's Guatemala, there's Iran-Contra, for which he was convicted. Mm-hmm. Then there was his involvement in the Iraq War. There was, as you say, he being the one to give the green light for the 2002 coup. And then he just appears in a State Department press conference as, the special envoy to restore democracy to Venezuela. It was really, bizarre if it wasn't dangerous.
No, I know exactly. I mean, we were emailing each other like when he was first announced, and I mean, we were saying like, it would be funny if he wasn't such a lunatic. And I mean, yeah, just what you're just. Rattling off all these things. I mean, any one of those. I mean, genocide in Guatemala, death squads in El Salvador, everything with Iran-Contra. People forget too, Iraq, so deeply involved in that. Plus, I mean, all of these things should disqualify this person, from ever. I mean, he should be in jail.
Yes.
But I mean, that's sort of beside the point. But I mean, if not in jail, I mean, he should just be nowhere near any sort of power source and dictate. And the fact that he's going to restore human rights and democracy to Venezuela is such a joke. But again, too, they're being so upfront. Like, you don't bring in Elliot Abrams
Yeah, this was kind of the high point of putting the cards all on the table.
Exactly, because even Elliot Abrams' own admission, I mean, he admits to doing all these horrible things. Like when he really gets like pressed on, like maybe the genocide, in Guatemala in the 80s. I mean, he said, "Oh well, but would you want the those commies to win? Like we won the Cold War. Like so what?" And like and he says like if you're gonna, and he kind of has a point here. It's like if you're gonna go after me, you should go after everybody. And it's like, well, yes, of course, but we're talking about you specifically right now. But yeah, he doesn't give a shit. I mean,
he's very unapologetic about his CV.
Yeah. Ricardo, we'll try to kind of wrap it up a little bit here. But I do want to kind of give you the last word on this, and also as well. I mean, maybe before we get to the end, I mean, what's your sense of how this is going to unfold in the next couple of weeks? I know that's a difficult question. Maybe you don't have an answer for that because again, the situation is so fluid. Things are changing so much. But my sense, from all the way here in New York, looking at the situation, is that they might have to kind of throw in the towel. The U.S. might have to sort of acquiesce to the fact that it's not going to happen. I mean, I mentioned this a couple of weeks back. I mean, it reminded me of when there were these protests in Iran a couple months back, and the MEK seemed to have its fingerprints on that. But there was again a same push from all the usual suspects: John Bolton, Marco Rubio, Rudy Giuliani, and others, Pompeo. That this is it. Iran's they're gonna rise up and overthrow the evil Ayatollah, and it didn't happen. And they kind of backed off of that. I mean, do you see that happening in Venezuela right now, or? I mean, God forbid, is it possible that they're gonna do something more extreme in order to get the kind of results that they want?
Well, there's no indication that anything extreme is going to happen soon. One factor to take into account is whether Trump can find a political victory elsewhere that's going to allow him to leave Venezuela alone. I don't expect anything too drastic to happen in the upcoming weeks. And the thing is that there's clearly nothing else for Guaido to do at the moment. So the only hope, which is no longer a short-term hope, but kind of a medium term, is that the sanctions are going to become so unbearable that they're going to generate some kind of chaos that will, I don't know, either force the government to resign or force the military to intervene. But so these are two plans. On one hand, this kind of immediate, self-proclamation, call on the army to back him, and on the other, this slow strangulation with sanctions that don't quite align, in terms of their timelines. So the challenge for Guaido is to kind of remain relevant until some kind of breaking point can be reached, and there's no sense that this breaking point is in the near future. So the government is in a very tricky situation, and it's kind of trying to survive and buy time and eventually get into some sort of dialogue that would at least force their enemies to recognize some legitimacy on their side, while at the same time they are scrambling to find, at least first and foremost, new oil buyers. So, they lost the US market, so they need to redirect oil to India or to China or to other Asian buyers. So that's more or less where we are at the moment. And the threat now, which was announced by by Bolton and Pompeo yesterday, is secondary sanctions, so that the US is going to go after non-US citizens and companies that do business with Venezuela. So they could, for example, sanction some Indian company that buys Venezuelan oil. So that would be maybe the last possible escalation that they could do, short of really putting their navy on the coast and stopping the oil from getting out.
Yeah, which would be a really extreme act. And once again, keep in mind that the U.S. will bandy about these numbers. 50 countries recognize Guaido. I mean, that's a drop in the bucket. They're all. I mean, there are I think 52 countries in Africa. Only one of them recognizes Guaido. So I mean,
Kingdom of Morocco.
Morocco, yes, exactly. So I mean, just this 50 countries, I mean, is irrelevant. The entire Caribbean, all of Africa for the most part, all of the Middle East, Asia, Oceania. I mean, all of the vast majority of people still recognize Maduro as as well they should. I mean, I guess I agree with you. I mean, the sanctions seem to be the only kind of card that they can play unless they're really kind of willing to do something a bit crazier. I mean, it seems that that's where they're going to go. But even I do wonder to the extent that, sanctioning other countries, I mean, sanctioning India and stuff like that. I mean, Trump has attempted to develop this closer relationship with India. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out if suddenly India can't buy oil from Venezuela. I mean, the whole thing, it just seems, again, the sort of interconnected globalization of everything. I mean, it's so tricky, when you start going after certain countries and companies and things like that. Ricardo, is there anything else that you want to leave the listeners with? Anything that we didn't cover that you want them to be aware of? Anything like that?
No, I think we pretty much covered everything. One thing that I would say, we were talking about the international recognition. There was an interview a few days ago with the Spanish foreign minister, and Spain played a bit of an interesting role in all of this. So in the beginning, there was a sense that Spain was proposing some kind of mediation mechanism, and then all of a sudden they switched sides completely and recognized Guaido. So this then was revealed to have been the result of U.S. pressure. But the Spanish foreign minister did an interview a couple of days ago, and he was very much saying that this has become a bit of an embarrassment. This is not how things are supposed to be done. So the interviewer was asking him, if who do you recognize as the legitimate president of Venezuela? He said, we recognize Juan Guaido, like many other countries. Okay, but if there's a problem with the Spanish citizen in Venezuela, who do you talk to? Well, we have to talk to whoever controls the territory, which in this case is the Maduro government. So that pretty much summed it up.
Oh, absolutely. That's such a great, way of, ending the show. And also just, again, exactly, if something really happens, who they're really going to call. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Here there's a joke that, some comedian was asked, who is the president of Venezuela? And he said, the president is whoever answers the phone in Miraflores. Miraflores is the presidential palace.
No, exactly, entirely. Ricardo, thank you so much for joining us. It was great that we could finally have you on. I would love to have you back on the show again sometime in the soon, maybe in the next couple of weeks. Certainly, we'll have plenty to talk about. Vis-a-vis the situation in Venezuela. But also, please do tell the listeners where they can go to follow your work. If you want to plug anything that you're working on right now, social media, any sites that the listeners should follow as well.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and I'll be happy to come back on in the near future. Yeah, I'll just recommend that people follow Venezuela Analysis, so venezuelaanalysis.com, and they'll also find the links to our social media. And we're not the only ones. You can also follow people like Max Blumenthal or Anya Parampil, who were on the ground very, very recently. They also do great work, and if you speak Spanish, then there are many journalists you can follow to get reliable information from the ground in Venezuela.
Excellent. And yeah, once again, I highly encourage everyone to check out VenezuelaAnalysis.com. Support them as well. They are, just like me, totally independently funded. Ricardo Vaz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Why are they not letting the US aid in that's sitting on the border between Venezuela and Brazil?
That is quite obvious, because look, you cannot be the tormentor. You cannot be the cause of the crisis and then play yourself as a good Samaritan. You cannot just asphyxiate the economy of a country as the United States did with Salvador Allende. And the thing is, when it didn't work, 3 years of economic war against Salvador Allende did not topple him. It was necessary to have the muscle of General Pinochet and have Salvador Allende murdered. So here you have a situation in which Guaido is lending itself to the interest of the United States, and there have been simply too many right-wing coups in Latin America. There was the coup in Grenada, there was the coup in Panama, there was the coup in Honduras.
Okay.
I mean, it's enough.